Well, listen, thank you so much for inviting me to come along to this virtual Zoom talk. Um, Finavarra, I'm crazy about County Clare. I just think it literally is the most interesting of all the counties in Ireland. But among my most favourite spots is this Finavarra. So if we look, what we're talking about is right here on the top of County Clare, this strange little peninsula. Um, to look at it more closely, I mean, the ancient name of the entire peninsula was Finavarra. That has broken down a little over time, where Finavarra is just the name of this townland. And you've got the Flaggy Shore, this bit is called Rhine. New Quay is probably the name that most people know it by. It was known as Burren as well, just Burren for quite a while. And it also includes this little island, which is off the shore of it, Auchenish. It's believed that Auchenish was actually part of Clare, fully joined before a tsunami a few centuries ago. But that is the reason why, although bizarrely now, if you want to go there, you need to drive all the way out towards Kinvara, hook a left, and then can come around. And there's a tiny little causeway that you can get across. So it's about 200 acres of land over here. So if you ever want to get to the top of County Clare, you need to stand on that spot. To look at it another way, it is very much at the very edge of the Burren. These are some of the classic huge Burren hills slash mountains that you have, these grey areas. And there's one here just in Finavarra. So let us see. The first item on my agenda takes us back to the early 1990s in Finavarra, where four tourists came along to see this. This is the Flaggy Shore, a remarkable piece of just lovely shoreline to walk along. And this is the road that runs alongside it. And here we are. This is the scene back in the early 90s. Two men and their two wives were sitting in the back. And then they drove along to the corner where this is the scene that unfolds. This is another of these Burren Hills, the classic ones. And this is Loch Muiree in front of it, which has pretty much always got some swans in it. Now, if that was anybody else, that would be the end of the story, except these were not just randomers. This was Brian Friel, more or less one of the most successful playwrights of the last 50 years, with Dancing at Lunasa, and of course, Seamus Heaney. So out of all that, Seamus Heaney wrote what is surely one of his best poems, Postscript, which begins, and sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare, along the Flaggy Shore in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off of each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild, with foam and glitter, and inland among stones, the surface of a slate-grey lake is lit by the earthed lightning of a flock of swans. Later, he uses this line, it's useless to think that you will park and capture it. But in fact, he did capture it in this poem. So the second thing about this area, which is very obvious when you get there, is this huge Martello Tower, right down on the point. It's a huge thing, you cannot miss it. The reason it's there is because of this guy, Wolfe Tone. In around Christmas 1796, he had convinced the French to come and help us in our efforts to have a rebellion against our lovely colonial neighbors. And actually amassed 25,000 Frenchmen and 48 ships. They arrived in Bantry Bay, which is down here, the Kerry Cork area, and storms, however, blew them off course. So much so that three ships, including Wolfe Tone and two others, arrived here into the Shannon Estuary and were off the coast of Kilbaha in Christmas 1796, forlornly hoping the rest would catch up. The locals from Kilbaha went out to them to see who it was and actually sold them eggs and chicken while they rested for a few days. But it all came to nothing. Nevertheless, it did in time lead to the 1798 rising, and the response of the British was to push defences all around the coast of Ireland. They put artillery batteries here, at Labashida, the Scattery Island, and then all the way up along the coast of Clare, various signalling towers, two of which are still left, and then the two Martello towers here at the top, one at Finavarra and one across in Auchenish. Their idea is to protect Galway Bay. Also at the Finavarra one, you have this, whoa, sorry, you have this nice little stone, which is still there. This means the War Department, number 15, all of their buildings numbered. The way to get into the Martello Tower involves risking life and limb because the only entrance is way off the ground. You have to pull yourself up on a dodgy rope. Well, I did one time, and this is what the interior looks like. The floors have fallen in, and yeah, it's a bit of a death trap as it stands, but I'm sure with work, it could quite easily be returned to its former glory. I do not have a drone myself, but I found this one on the internet, this picture. You can see that on the top of the Martello Tower to this day is one of the cannons lying there still. This is one of the buildings. This was the master gunner's house that he got to live in while the soldiers lived in the building itself. Also still extant is this map of the facility which they made. Now here's your tower. Interestingly, you have things like the men's toilet, the women's toilet, and the master gunner gets his own private toilet, which is nice when there's only 3 of them. There's also quite a few piggeries around here. And what's most remarkable about it all is that, as you can see, there's quite a few fields and it's all laid out. But now, today, I guarantee the land does not go past about here. It's much, much smaller. So there has been a massive amount of erosion in I think it was 150 years ago they made this map. But since then, there's a lot less left. So, I mean, perhaps the sea will come in as far as the tower in time. So, what is my third thing to say? Another remarkable monument around there is this. It's just found in Finavarra on the shore. What it is most likely to be a market stone, a place where markets took place during the medieval period. There's 2 others within Clare, quite similar. This one is at Colm Liddy, near the graveyard. This one is at Nugaval, a church. And what's so fascinating about these is that if you go back to Celtic times, trade was a barter system which was strictly regulated, and people knew what value a thing was. A cow equals 8 sheep. A sheep equals 5 hens, and so on. But the idea of commerce, where you essentially try to get more out of people, was kind of an alien concept. So when actual capitalism arrived, it was not something that you could do with your friends and neighbors. So you only did it with people outside the tribe. Hence and why, in the ancient tribes of Clare, of which there were essentially 3, the Kirkabashkin down south, the Dalgash, which are down this area, and up here, the Kirkamadru. This, what is later became the barony of Burren, was also in a more ancient way where the Kirkamadru lived. And so their trading posts are here, Finavarra, where obviously the border is with the sea, Glenculmkill, also on an edge, and Nugaval, also on an edge. So essentially, you can only practice capitalism with strangers. That's the message. Also close to the monument, you can see here this set of rocks down on shore. From this angle, it's more clear what we're looking at. The ruin of an ancient pier. So it's safe to say that at time, going back, possibly at least 1,000 years, this was a place probably where trade took place with tribes from Galway in various things. Number 4, now I've said all that about the market stone, and yet there is a totally different interpretation possible also. On the stone, there is this marking, now quite unclear, but it was put there quite late in the day, in the 19th century, and it claims that this is a monument to Donogh Mór O'Daly, he being a great poet of the Gaelic era from the 1200s. And what is known for a fact is that across the road from it, there was a school of poetry. This is at the time now when poetry is a very big deal indeed. It's part of the Gaelic culture, a very important part. The learned men had to be trained for possibly a decade in how to make these extremely exacting pieces of poetry that were popular then. There's a picture that was made in the 1500s, just as England began to take over. They drew pictures of what they saw, and this is a typical Irish bard, filly, poet at the time, declaiming his works, often with a harp accompaniment that was quite common. And they were learned men, as well as being able to create poetry. They had memorized a vast quantity of it. They also were experts in the history of Ireland and in the genealogy of each person. So a very important part of the court. In the hillside, also behind that hill that we saw earlier near the lake, this is a drawing done in the 1800s called the Brehen's Chair at Finavarra, this kind of a formation in the rocks. Now, the disappointed thing about this is we cannot find it. Some of the finest minds in Clare history have gone up to this place in recent years looking for it. And whether or not it's there, but possibly under briars, or whether it has been reclaimed out of existence, we cannot be sure. But it also points to the fact about the really, truly ancient connections of this place. I mean, Finavarra is being mentioned in documents from certainly the 1200s on because of the poetry school. And, you go back to before you have poets, you also have these brehens, meaning the lawyers essentially of this Celtic world. Another bizarre thing that I only found quite recently in the internet is this. You'll find this on YouTube. It's a video made by this guy, Pat Cronin, where he visits in that hillside a souterrain, meaning, in other words, an underground chamber, which is in the hillside. And it's quite bizarre. He basically goes in through a tiny little hole in the ground into this place. And then inside, there's an even smaller hole that you can crawl through. And incredibly, there are actually 3 interconnected rooms buried in that hill that we saw earlier. What are they for? Well, at least one theory is that the poetry schools of that time occasionally made their students go into very secluded places indeed to help their concentration, because they had massive amounts, of course, of Latin and Irish poetry to learn off by heart. So the truth is its exact purpose is not known, but these 3 interconnected rooms exist inside on the hillside at Finavarra, and it seemed likely that they are connected to the poetry school. While I'm on that topic of this ancient Celtic stuff, it would be remiss not to mention this. It's slightly outside of Finavarra, on the road towards the Galway border. There is a green road high up on the hillside of the Burren right there. And on the green road, you'll find St. Patrick's Well. Now, the thing is, St. Patrick did not visit Clare at any time. I guess we were all kind of holy enough already, perhaps. But what can be said about holy wells in general in Ireland, they simply were an adaptation of the previous pagan religion, the druid religion of the classic Celtic period, because the druid works most certainly always took place at water. So the holy wells of Ireland are by and large more ancient than we even know. Before the modern Catholic Church, which really only dates to around 1850, when we became serious about going to Mass, the previous many hundreds of years had a Catholicism which was centered around festivals and going to holy wells and saying your prayers there. Well, these holy wells go back another perhaps 1,000 years insofar as they were part of the Celtic religion that predated Christianity. Also at this particular site is another slightly mystical item. There is a large hunk of rock like this, which is thought to be an altar. There is some strange script in it, which can be deciphered. It's from the 1700s. But then there is this strange little man there, which, well, no one really knows what that is. Now, moving on, we have this little guy, also in Finavarra. It's the remnants of a fascinating thing, an industry that they had there in the latter part of the 19th century. where they were collecting lobsters. Now, lobsters are a thing where you simply cannot catch them and bring them in any way dead to the table. They absolutely have to be alive because from the moment they die, they're kind of going off. So this was a period in history where the appetite for lobsters in the fine restaurants of London had reached epic levels. But the only problem was that they had overfished the lobsters within Britain. So they reached further afield, and a guy called the Scoville family, they began to use Finavarra. They realized that they could turn this area of Finavarra into a massive lobster pond, which is what they did. So where that place earlier there with those circly things, that's here. And I guess it forms as some sort of valve to let water in and out. But what happened was that during that era, they would have the local fishermen, both from Galway and Clare, catching lobsters as fast as they could and bringing them to dump them into this particular lake where they would be minded, kept alive until they were ready. And even still, they would be brought then in boxes to the railway, the local railway, and brought to Dublin and to London, kept kind of wet, but kept alive. And they'd be in London more or less 24 hours later. So it was quite a worthwhile industry during the later 19th century there for the people of Finavarra. Now, this is another shot of it, but recently I have been there, and I'm pretty sure that the most recent storm that we had a few months ago, Storm Owen, may have knocked this one here, because I could not see two of them the last time I was there, which is a shame. It should also be noted that on the other side of the peninsula, the Flaggy Shore side, there's a connection to a thing called Red Bank oysters. Now, there was a period again in the 19th century where, like the way we feel in Ireland now about strawberries, they have to be from Wexford. It would not matter if you made the best strawberries you could in Limerick, no one's interested. They have to be from Wexford. Well, similarly, oysters from the Red Bank, which is just there off the Flaggy Shore, were considered to be the absolute best. And that led to a spin-off being the Red Bank restaurant, which was in Delir Street in Dublin. And that became ultimately one of the finest restaurants in Dublin. You can still see, actually, it's there now, that particular building, and it has been turned into a hostel, the Ashfield Hostel. So I guess you could stay there quite cheaply. But on the outside, there's these tiny little carvings of shellfish and lobsters and things like that. That's still there, one of those kind of ghost signs. And all of that led to the rather interesting outcome that this guy, James Joyce, has a running thread in Ulysses about Red Bank oysters. They are mentioned 5 times. Leopold Bloom thinks about them. Molly Bloom thinks about them. And the connecting reason is, of course, that oysters are regarded as an aphrodisiac. And what Leopold does not know is that a guy called Blazes Boylan, who he sees outside the Red Bank restaurant, is actually Molly's secret lover. Anywho, that's how it bizarrely makes its way into Ulysses. Right, moving along and still on a literary theme, we have this place. It's called Mount Vernon, and it overlooks the Flaggy Shore on that side of the peninsula. A house built around, I think it's 1780, by a William Percy. And William was a pen pal of this bucko, meaning George Washington, first president of the US. And so much so that it's believed that this George Washington sent over the seedlings for these trees, which are in the grounds of Mount Vernon. And whatever about that, that's not quite certain. What is quite certain is that William sent George seedlings of these gooseberries, because once George had obviously beat the Brits out of the USA and founded a country. He liked nothing better than to do a bit of gardening at his place, which is also called Mount Vernon. I mean, obviously, this one is named in honor of it. But our man, anyway, sent over seedlings of gooseberries. And this can be seen because every word that George Washington ever wrote is available. And we have his thank you letter, which we can read online. Anyway, a few generations later, the house has come down to this lady, Augusta Gregory, Lady Gregory. She's quite famous for being one of the driving forces in the Irish cultural revival and nationalism. And part of her thing, obviously her main residence was in Coole Park, but she chose Mount Vernon as her summer house. That meant a lot of famous people went there as her guest. This guy, George Bernard Shaw, was there in the early 1900s. And not well known, but he actually wrote a play. He wrote an epic series of plays. I mean, obviously his most famous one is Pygmalion, which became My Fair Lady. But he wrote other ones, and this one is called Back to Methuselah. It's an epic 5-play cycle which takes you from the Garden of Eden to the end of time. And in the 4th part of it, bizarrely, he starts it, scene 1, right here on this stone thing, which he describes so perfectly here on Burren Pier, and he describes the steps down into the sea. And the entire thing, it's now very dialogue. I would not say it was a great play, but it's also, it should be said bizarrely, it's set in the year 3000 AD. And I think he's right. Most likely that stone will still be there in 3000 AD. We can only hope. Also in Mount Vernon, of course, was this fellow, W.B. Yeats. And particularly in the summer of 1915, something interesting happened. Obviously, World War I was happening, but this is Robert Gregory, Lady Gregory's son, her only child, and her golden boy. So he's there with his wife, and he has 3 children. Naturally, somebody else is minding them. So that summer, he and his wife and an artistic couple they know called Nora Summers and Gerald, the 4 of them are having a jolly time in Mount Vernon. And all is well until Margaret comes home from a walk along the shore and sees our man here in flagrante with Nora. So obviously, and then he punches the husband also. So the upshot of all of that is naturally he's in the doghouse with his wife and indeed his mother. So Yeats comes and visits after all this has happened, gets all the scandal of what has happened, but also intriguingly, your man tells him that he has had a recurring dream, a dream in which he sees an aeroplane crashing to the ground and in a ball of flames. That's all fine, except that a month later, our man, to escape his miserable now domestic circumstances, decides to sign up for the war. He becomes a fighter pilot, a very good one at that. He downs 18 German planes during the war. But when there's just a few months to go, he himself gets shot down over the coast of Italy to his death. And that's it. William Yeats, well, he takes life and turns it into art. And one of his best known poems is this one: An Irish airman foresees his death. So that came out of events at Mount Vernon. Also, and it's a bit more tenuous, but in the latter years, around the last 40 years, Mount Vernon has been owned by the Helmore family. And this guy, Brian Ferry, he married Lucy Helmore and had 4 children with her. They were married for 20 years. This is a Lucy on the cover of Roxy Music's most famous album, Avalon. So I think it's safe to say he visited there also along the line. Now, the Finavarra area, if we look at it in the earliest Ordnance Survey map, it's quite fascinating. Here we have Finavarra House, home at that stage of the Skerritt family. They were recognised as good landlords, and you can see quite a bit of it still, and this wall is all very much extant. And then you have Finavarra itself. To be honest, a massive amount of houses, considering what a rural place it is. Huge amount of houses, who are essentially, of course, the workforce that keeps Finavarra House. Their domestic servants and agriculture and whatnot. The area was really quite excellent agriculturally because of this. On several shores, there is a massive amount of seaweed. And seaweed, although of course parts of the area are rock, that which is grass responds very well, particularly in an era where fertilizers did not exist. Seaweed was absolutely magic so it made the whole area really quite good agriculturally. But ultimately, the Skerritt family died out. Ultimately, the male line died out, and it's quite sad to read of their final days. The family, all the trees that you saw on the earlier map, they just chopped them all down, in their latter era, and they had auctions and sold all their stuff. But quite a bit of the shell of the building and outhouses are still there. Overall, during that period, you'd have to say, whereas the population of Clare just before the famine was 300,000, and it fell to 124 over this 50-year period. Population of the Burren barony, also, it was pretty much a third once that era was over. Let us move now to 1831, a period when there was an outbreak of violence throughout Clare. Throughout Clare or Irish history during that period, you have what are known as white boys. They are kind of rural terrorists who operate from time to time to fix things when things are getting just too impossible for the ordinary peasantry. But in Clare, the biggest surge of them had a different name. They were called the Terry Alts. And the Terry Alts did their best work in the years around 1830. And there was a 6-month period where they were extremely, the whole county, if you like, had become a bit of a war zone. Some of their acts were actually complete violence. There were around 20 murders in a 6-month period. There was also a lot of threatening people and, more minor acts of beatings. But by far their biggest protest, which was essentially about the price of potatoes in an era when Ireland was having one of its mini famines, if you like. Well, during that period, they were basically doing a thing where as the landlords moved more towards having cattle, just having grazing land, these guys would arrive at night and dig up huge areas of ground. Sometimes as many as 1,000 people would assemble and under cover of darkness with shovels dig up as much as 30 acres of ground, which would then obviously only be revealed really in the morning. And the idea was that simply at that stage, the landlords would have no other option but to set the ground for potatoes, which is what they all needed, of course. It was what we lived on, particularly for those last 30 years before the famine. Anyway, amongst all that, the government decided to come down very, very hard indeed on even those who had not been involved in actually violent crime. And they brought them all here this is the centre of Ennis during that period. This is the Ennis courthouse of the era. This is recognisable still to some extent as the Hythe in Ennis, except, of course, that the courthouse was demolished perhaps 20 years later. But I mean, that building there is pretty much exactly the same way as it is now. And that's the beginning of Bank Place and Bindon Street. That's Abbey Street over there. So in the dock on this particular day, amongst many, was Edward Ryan of Finavarra. He was a ploughman, married with 4 children between 10 and 20. And you can read his court case. It's just another thing that's available online because the entire court proceedings, were recorded and made into a booklet at the time. A lot of the people will say were dealt with unfairly, but in his case, that is indeed the case. The attack that he was accused of being involved in, now it was a non-violent one, it was more of a threatening kind of one, was over on the shore of Lough Derg, literally at the furthest possible end, practically, from the county. It was 40 miles away, and this man now was a poor man. He did not have a horse. There is no way that he could have been 40 miles away. His accuser was also a person who had a grudge against him. And there was 3 witnesses who placed him in Finavarra on the night in question when he was meant to be 40 miles away. Well, naturally, anyway, he was still found guilty. He was sentenced initially to death, but that was commuted to transportation for life. So the way that worked at the time was you were put into a prison ship down in Cove in Cork. This is the kind of one we have here. And we do know actually quite a bit about his journey because the logs of the doctors that were on these journeys are still can be read. So that particular journey to Australia took 4 months, was particularly bad. 14 of them died. Quite a few were sick with dysentery and scurvy. And when he arrived, he was signed to work. The convicts were each given essentially a farmer with a large plantation and assigned to them. It is also listed that Edward Ryan was eventually pardoned 17 years later in 1848. This, after all, now was a man with a wife and 4 children. But it seems unlikely that 17 years later he was pardoned, but that's where he disappears from history. But I think it's fairly unlikely that he ever went back to Ireland. Certainly 1814, 48 would not have been a good year to attempt to go back anyway. Right, number 9. We have here another event from Irish history, which people will be reasonably familiar with, I think, is this one. It's the gun running, which preceded 1916 and preceded the War of Independence. Erskine Childers and a crew which included this, his wife, Molly Childers, and Mary Spring Rice. They went over and got a vast amount of guns and ammunition for the nationalist cause here. So the volunteers on the quay when they arrived back in Dublin at Howth. And the bizarre thing is that's quite a famous incident, of course. That 2 weeks earlier, it had happened at Finavarra. So this is the Kerry News telling us that the volunteers of North Tipperary have got a cargo of arms donated by the Tipperary Men's Association in America, and they landed at Finavarra Point, West Galway. Okay, whatever, these are Kerry people, but no, it's in Clare. And then they brought the arms all the way across Clare and over to Lough, and they were in Tipperary before anybody knew about it. So Tipperary, of course, would go on to become one of the most violent parts of Ireland during the War of Independence. The War of Independence, one of the most things you could say about it is that although it was general around Ireland, there were some counties where it was far more violent, and they would be, Dublin, Cork, Tip, Limerick, and indeed Clare is ranked as the 4th most violent county. But there were other places where not much happened. But anyway, yes, the early arms that Tip got were brought through Finavarra. This would have been the approach, of course, here to Finavarra Point. And actually from there, you can see again the massive erosion that has taken place in recent years. All of this was green fields when the British made their map of the area. Now, we're kind of running out of time, but I just have to squeeze 1 or 2 more in. This I came across quite recently, and I still haven't really got to the bottom of it. But in the area of Irish people who emigrated to America, there is an American professor called Kirby Miller. I highly recommend. All his books are fantastic on that subject. And in recent years, I just saw it on the news, he has donated his entire archive, which are letters from and to Irish immigrants to America. And he's donated it to the college in Galway. And I see that a lot of it now is being digitized. And hence, I just the other night went in to see was there anything of interest, and lo and behold, there is. So what we have here is a letter written in Newquay, in the Burren, in May the 13th, I think it is, and the date is 1863. Sir, I take the liberty of asking you, where will I apply to know? And what it is he's a guy called James Murphy, from obviously Newquay Burren, and he's writing to what amounts to the American ambassador who was in Galway at that time. And bizarrely, he's asking, will this guy please transport him across to America because he wants to join the Union Army and get involved. He is particularly enthralled to a guy here called Corcoran. Corcoran is a Sligo man, like a lot of people who had left during and around the famine were now in pole position to actually fight in the US Civil War. They reckon around 200,000 Irish people fought in the war. And Corcoran was kind of a leader of an Irish brigade who did a lot of great stuff. And we read here from our man anyway, I would suffer death for North America. and the gallant Corcoran. I send you a stamped envelope for your reply. I remain your humble servant, James Murphy. So I don't know. We can only wonder what James Murphy's life was like in New Quay that he would want to be transported straight to a war zone in America. But and whether or not it actually happened, I do not know. James Murphy is not the most Googleable name. I'm sure there was probably 100 James Murphys in the US Army. But anyway, perhaps I'll eventually find out. Now then, to 9.5. About the Finavarra area, it has to be said there's a lot of small businesses, fine businesses, such as Lonan's and this place where you can buy vegetables with an honesty box. But one I absolutely love is Cafe Lunella. When I go there for a walk, it's never complete unless I call in, because of course they make ice cream from their very own cows, which are right there on the site, and it's nice. Well, anyway, a few years ago, I was there with my family, and we were coming out of the cafe, and lo and behold, we saw a celebrity sitting in his car right there. And no, like most Irish people, obviously, I was casual and thought we'll leave the man alone. We will not say a word to him. But naturally, my son would not be held back. And he ran over and said, "Hi, Marty Whelan. We are your biggest fans." And in fairness to Marty, he responded well to this situation. He reached into his glove compartment and handed my son a little souvenir, which is this: a tiny little fridge magnet, which to this day is on our fridge. So, I have to say well done to Marty. He handled it well. So that is all I have to say really about Finavarra. It's a kind of place where there is so much of historical interest, so much that it's scenic beyond, belief. And who knows, you could possibly run into somebody like Marty Whelan as well, or other minor celebrities. So this is me. I'm Colm Liddy. I have written a few books. You can get them, generally speaking, in they're in the Ennis gift shop. They're in the one in Lahinch, in Ennisdime, and in Kilrush, the banner one. And these are about Newmarket Fergus, where I'm from. This is about Dromoland. This one is about Nan Hogan. She was the leader of Cumann in County Clare, and fascinating life. It's about the War of Independence, particularly from a female perspective, because also she wound up being in Kilmainham jail, where she shared a cell with Grace Gifford, the Grace Gifford of whom the song Grace is about. Also, I have these T-shirts, which are again on the theme of my thinking this is the most excellent county, and this is a bunch of stuff that we should be very proud of. Honestly, no other county comes close, and that is me. If you'd like to contact me about anything, feel free to take my details here, and I'm also on social media and have some things here on this shop in Ireland.